Thanks to everybody for being here. My name is Russ Latino. I'm the president of Empower Mississippi. Empower was founded to be focused, and the initial focus was around education. And how do we provide a world-class education to the people of Mississippi, to the children of Mississippi, so that ultimately they're equipped in a way to be successful throughout life, to become lifelong learners. And then in 2018, Empower added to its sort of complement of focus areas criminal justice reform. And you just heard a great panel on criminal justice reform and a really timely discussion given the increase in crime rates and at the same time a conversation around what it looks like for the justice system to operate in a way that is fairly, that treats people equitably. And then 2 years ago, we decided to expand out to include the issue area of work. And a big part of that was a recognition that there was a gap in the focus areas between education and criminal justice. And that we looked at it, the thought process was, well, certainly you need a good education to be equipped for life, but you also need economic opportunities to be able to use that education to provide for yourself, to provide for your family. And then the thought process was, if you can get a good education, you can get a good job. And if you get a good job, you can stay out of trouble. Or if you've fallen into trouble, you've got the opportunity when you get out to climb out of that, right? And so we started work in earnest, and we've worked on a lot of different issues. But in the back of our heads has been this idea that Mississippi obviously historically has struggled with real poverty. It's struggled with low incomes. And it seems that so much of the conversation around poverty centers around a false dichotomy. Forrest mentioned a false dichotomy earlier. Centers around a false dichotomy. And so we wanted to have a conversation today about poverty. A lot of the conversation that's unfolded so far today has been a conversation around solutions, and we'll talk some about some potential solutions. But this was really an invitation to start a conversation around how we address poverty in the state of Mississippi. And so I'm super excited to have the two panelists that we've got. Randy Hicks is the president and CEO of the Georgia Center for Opportunity. He is a longtime friend of Empower and many of the people that work at Empower, but Randy has a real heart for people. And I've learned that about him in a short period of time and just really impressed with the work that he's doing in Georgia. And then Diann Payne ran for 2 decades as the executive director of the Jackson County Civic Action Committee. Did I get that right?
Yes, that's correct.
That really focused on how to build personal development and self-sufficiency skills in that community. She now runs an organization that is LifeWise. Did I get that right?
Yes.
And I'm not always good at this stuff. So, and the focus there is very similar. It's about teaching people really how to develop life skills. And so, very excited to have both. Randy, you and I talked about this a couple of weeks ago at an event we were at, but you've worked for a long time around poverty in Georgia. But you run a conservative think tank, and I think the sort of the worldview around what conservatives would think about poverty is that you wouldn't care about poor people, or that conservatives don't care about poor people. And that's obviously untrue. But I'm curious, when you got it in your head that we need to change our approach, we need to engage with people that are struggling or mired in poverty, why you did it. What was the sort of motivating factor for you?
Yeah, well, Forrest talked about it a little bit. And by the way, I was excited about being here. It's an honor to be here. I thought it was going to be an honor, and then Forrest made his Georgia Hicks joke. But I'm still happy to be here. So Forrest described it a little bit. We were asked by the state to go into the inner city and work with leaders, pastors and community leaders on making sure that there were resources available to strengthen family relationships. And after a year, as Forrest said, staff came back, said we need to get involved in prisoner reentry. And that was a big eye-opener, because I think one of the things that's really easy to think is that, man, if people would just pull themselves up by the bootstraps, start making good decisions, I think that kind of mindset can infect a lot of people and infect a lot of thinking. And I wasn't quite that bad, but there was a little bit of that. And I suddenly became more aware of the challenges that people in poverty face, people who have criminal records, and our entire team did. But when it comes right down to it, one of the defining American ideas, arguably the defining American idea, is that everyone should have an opportunity to achieve a better life, regardless of race, circumstances of one's birth, regardless of past mistakes. And we talk a lot about opportunity as Americans generally, and I would say people on the center right talk about opportunity a lot. But we didn't necessarily have a really clear picture about all of those things that hold people back. And so we really wanted to understand that in a really deep way and become champions for those for whom it was more difficult to achieve that better life. What are the barriers that are getting in the way of people achieving that better life? Now, one of the things, and this may come up again at another point during our conversation, we became familiar with what is now called the success sequence. It was based on research that was produced by the Brookings Institution out of Washington, D.C., and they looked at reams of research, and essentially they came back with this. Of all Americans, of all adult Americans who have at least graduated from high school, found steady employment, waited till they were married to have kids, only 2% are living in poverty at this moment. Of those who've gotten those three things wrong, it's 75%. And so hearing that information was a bit of an eye-opener for us. Here we are asking, why is it that people are stuck in poverty? Because that's often the case. What causes poverty? And then that research comes and really enlightened us. So we organized our whole organization around those three issues. And then the last thing I'll say to kind of kick this off and to answer your question is this. When I talk about the success sequence, when we talk about the success sequence, one thing you should understand is that is a simple picture of complex realities, right? It's not as simple as standing on street corners and telling people, get a diploma, get a job, and get a spouse before you get a baby, right? I mean, it's just not that simple. It's a simple picture of a complex reality. And the complexity is in what's keeping people from getting the education they need, what's keeping people from getting the job they need, and what's keeping people from forming that stable and healthy family life that virtually everybody wants in one form or another.
I think that's powerful. Diann, your experience is on the ground in Mississippi. And I was thinking about the Teddy Roosevelt quote about the arena, right? The credit belongs not to the spectator, but the people who get their hands dirty, who roll up their sleeves and get engaged. And you did that for 2 decades and are still doing that in your community now. Talk to me a little bit about what poverty looks like in Mississippi and the communities that you've served and what you've observed about root causes of poverty.
Well, primarily, one of I think the problems in Mississippi, we tend to look at the state the same, but it's quite different from the Delta than the coast or from Corinth because of the proximity to Tennessee and job opportunities. And I think that's a problem. So when you look at some of the programs that we ran, and a lot of the problems with those programs, there's no consistency from one administration to the next. And a lot of money is poured into those programs. And even when you come to the state and they are passed through grants through the state of Mississippi, the policies for one program, the same block of money is quite different from another. So that's bureaucracy. And so when you talk about, the federal poverty guidelines in Mississippi, if you're living in Pascagoula, Mississippi, where there's job opportunities and it's the median income is higher, you're going to be faced with the same poverty rate in Jackson County that you would be in Neshoba County or a county in the Delta, LaFleur County, and it's quite different.
Yeah.
If you're making $15,000 in Greenville, it's going to be totally different from making $15,000 in Tutwiler, right?
Yeah.
So it's hard to administer those programs. And I think when the governor talked about today the federal money, and I think the state needs to influence that money because it's impacting the citizens of the state, and it's holding back the community action agencies, particularly, from really doing a better job. And so the other thing that I've learned with poverty, and it's very complex, and it's different from someone in Pascagoula than someone in Byhalia, Mississippi, where I'm from, is when you think about poverty, we tend to think about money, and that's an issue. It can be another resource. You talked about in some of the panels today, if we give them tools, not financial tools, but behavioral tools that they can use. The fatherhood initiative that we've had in the state, it stops and starts. We know that all kids have fathers, right? But we've never been consistent with that program, and it's a great program. So we really need to rethink resources. And I think I'm really a true fiscal conservative. I don't think you should spend more than you make. I just don't. In every aspect of my life, I really don't think that money is always the answer, but it does take some money, and we are spending a lot of money. As I listened today to the previous panels and the resources that they need, they already exist in the state. Everything is siloed.
Yeah, I think that's a big problem, not only in this space, but across the way the government often operates, and that you've got lots of agencies that are all trying to do good things, oftentimes with really good people operating, but they don't know what other people are doing, right? And so you end up with a lot of duplication, a lot of overlap, where there could be greater efficiencies. Randy, I think something that Diann just mentioned is pretty important too, which is that poverty can be a community by community approach.
That's right.
And a lot of ways that fits into my worldview, I think your worldview, that most problems should get solved at that community level because those are the people that have the most interest. Those are the people who know each other the best, right? And it's not some far-flung bureaucracy, to quote, a Reaganism here. It's people on the ground making a difference. Yeah. I'm curious, in your experience in Georgia, do you see different root causes of poverty, and then do you see sort of community responses that you think have been particularly effective or have promise?
Yeah, very good question. I love all that Diann said. I think one of the things that's absolutely true is that the causes of poverty may vary from person to person, but there's some common themes often with poverty. And I'd break it up into a few things. One would be relationship. So oftentimes poverty is driven by a poverty of relationships or the right kind of constructive, healthy relationships. There's a brokenness often with a family. And this is true, rural, urban, doesn't matter. There's often, not always, a brokenness in the family. There's brokenness with the community. You have fewer resources available. There's just fragmentation. It doesn't mean there's not community. It doesn't mean that people don't care about each other. It doesn't mean that people don't have any agency, but there's real brokenness in terms of relationship. The other thing I would say, and I just use the word, is agency. One of the things that I think you find in impoverished areas is that people don't typically feel like they have much agency. Now, that's not the word they'll use, but their choices are so limited, right? You have a single mom raising kids, whether in a rural area or an urban area, feeling like I really don't have choices when it comes to my child's education. There's a lack of agency. You have people who say, I don't have agency to go find the job I want. I'm not in a position to do that. Why? I didn't get the education I needed to put me in a position. It's a sense of lack of agency, this idea that I can take an action that will produce a result. Now, again, they have agency, but oftentimes that starts being expressed in more destructive ways because they're going to act, and actions will produce results. And then the other thing I'd say is, I'd look at that success sequence again. One of the values of the success sequence, simple picture, complex reality, is that it gives an individual a sense of where they are in that sequence and can give them a sense of agency in a particular area. Look, I'm 15 years old, I'm in high school. I don't need to worry about the next 2 steps. This is it. And I actually, if I focus here, if I get the right kind of help, I can succeed. Similarly, someone who may not have graduated from high school, they can get that sense of agency when you start talking about work. And the other good thing I think about the success sequence is it gives community leaders, and I think philanthropists and business leaders, a sense of how to focus their resources. So it may help kids and young adults focus their energies. It can help leaders focus their resources and their efforts as well.
That all makes a ton of sense, and you hit on something when you're talking about the success sequence around, taking it one bite at a time, which makes just a ton of sense. Like, let me get through high school, and then I'll worry about getting the job. Let me get the job, and then I'll think about getting married before I have kids. But in Mississippi, that last one is particularly problematic. Yeah. And so I think it's unfolding across the country, but it's kind of the elephant in the room that nobody wants to talk about because it feels like you're being judgmental when you talk about fatherlessness. Yeah. And the truth is there are a lot of incredible single parents, both men and women, who are working extremely hard to take care of their kids, and they're doing great jobs. But the truth is also that if you look at the hard data, that a single-parent household in Mississippi, the median household income is $26,000. The double-parent or two-parent household in Mississippi, the median household income is $83,000. So we're not talking about half, we're talking about close to a fourth of the income. And there are a lot of different complex factors that feed into that. But in terms of being able to provide for a family, fatherlessness is a really big problem, particularly when Mississippi has the worst rate in the country, which is over half of children today in Mississippi are being born out of wedlock. There are 5 or 6 counties where 90% plus of children who are being born out of wedlock. And so that creates a really difficult environment when we're talking about something like the success sequence. I wonder if you have thoughts on how to address that thorny issue.
Yeah, it is a thorny issue. We've always been very keenly aware, and sometimes become aware the hard way, that when you talk about single parenthood and you talk about children being born out of wedlock, you can sound like a moralistic wag, right? I mean, you can really...
I get that a lot, by the way. So it's
No, I mean, and it's a difficult thing, and I think, we've been talking about redemption much of the day. We've been talking, about maybe not always in these words, but grace and mercy. People make mistakes. I've made mistakes. I just didn't make that one. Mm-hmm. It's a consequential one. But I think another thing we've been talking about is hope, right? So I think whenever we talk about these things, we always need to talk about a hopeful way forward. I think that's absolutely key. For the single mom, right? The single dad, the child of a single parent, where it's not, a disaster. It's something that you just need to be aware of, and we're going to work on it together to make life better. And here's a way to do it. And I'll say one other thing. I think this is really important. There's such a difference on this issue of single parenthood, and I would also say on most of these issues we've talked about today. There's a real interesting thing that happens in the political arena. Often, most of the time, there's an effort to differentiate yourself from the other candidate or the other party, right? Constant effort to differentiate. The interesting thing about the community, and we do a lot of community work, we'll probably end up talking a bit about that. We do a lot of work actually in the community in addition to our policy work. The interesting thing in the community is that it's more about commonalities than differentiation, because you have people who are actually looking for common concerns. They recognize common problems, and they're looking for solutions that they can all embrace. And I think that's one of the reasons, by the way, that among many, actually, that work at the community level is easily the most important. Mm-hmm. And that no community should sit around waiting for the government to take action on unwed childbearing, even on education. There are things that can be done now, and we should be taking that kind of action, because when you're when you're in the community, you're finding more common ground because you're a community of common interest.
So, Lyndon Johnson in the mid-'60s famously declares war on poverty. And at the time, and I'm paraphrasing, he says something along the lines of, for this to be successful, we actually have to eliminate poverty or help eradicate poverty, not just make people more comfortable in the condition of being impoverished. We've spent over $30 trillion federally on programs that are designed to help people that are in poverty. And if you were to look at the poverty rate in the 1960s versus the poverty rate today, what you would see is that there's been a very slight decline in the percentage of the population that is identified as impoverished. And so by Johnson's own standard, the program hasn't been successful. And Diann, you mentioned your fiscal conservatism earlier. I wonder what you would say to a friend who is progressive who says the real problem is that we just haven't tried to do enough.
Well, I would disagree with that, obviously. I think it's not an issue of the money, it's the policy. And it's also the accountability that people talked about earlier. We should want the same accountability they talked about in criminal justice reform. We should want that same accountability for people that are running the programs, from MDHS down to community action. And when we talked earlier, when they were talking earlier, I think all of these systems are inextricably linked. You know, they're just getting the money from whether it's the Department of Justice or Health and Human Services or the Department of Education. It's all tax dollars. And there's no coordination, especially when you're addressing the issues of, even in schools, you know, they talked about what the children need. Then why aren't the systems that are getting paid to address those needs, why aren't they working with the schools? You know, when I was listening to the panel earlier, and they were talking about, and the sheriff said they'll need a deposit. Well, community action could make that deposit. We have the money. There's no reason why they should have to do the work and provide that service when someone is getting paid to provide that service. And I think that comes from, it's going to have to come from the leadership within the state, understanding where all of this money is coming into the state and who's really held accountable.
And Randy, I'd be curious how you'd answer that question too, but also how you would address sort of the narratives that come from the right. And you alluded to this a little bit in your introductory remarks about sort of the pull themselves up by the bootstraps. Yeah. But I think there's this prevailing sense of a lot of conservatives that, you know, people just need to go get a job, right? Or that there are a lot of people who are on the sidelines by choice. And there certainly is a segment of the population that has been sort of relegated or relegated themselves to the sideline. But how do you deal with the narratives that probably are destructive towards finding a solution?
Yeah. So first I'd go back. Work is important. In fact, just think about, I'd say this to all of you, I think about what it means to be human. Think about what it means to be you, just what it means to be you. And you'll recognize that a job is more than just a source of income. It's a source of purpose and belonging. It provides one with a sense of well-being that comes with earning success and enjoying the fruits of one's labor and just being needed by a community. In this case, that can be a workplace, right? But let's go back 30 years, related to this issue, jump back 30 years before the war on poverty was declared. And you've got FDR, Franklin Roosevelt, who really initiated so many of our welfare and relief programs. FDR in 1935 gave a State of the Union address where he was talking about the effectiveness of some of their government relief programs. And one of the things that he said was, we have to stop doling out relief in this way. And here's what he was talking about. We have to stop doling out relief and not expecting work. In fact, he said to dole out relief, these are his exact words, to dole out relief in that way is to administer a narcotic, a subtle destroyer of the human spirit. That is a powerful statement coming from FDR, right? He knew this, and he was talking about evidence if you go look at the speech. It's a powerful statement FDR made. And yet along the way, we've just not figured out how to reinforce that idea. I think one of the mistakes conservatives have made has typically been, we care about the poor, we just think civil society should handle it. And on the left, it's oftentimes, we care about the poor, we think government should handle it. But I think a mistake both sides often make is, it's losing that sense of the dignity of the individual who is poor, right? So I was at a meeting a couple years ago in Atlanta, Metro Atlanta. We have this very well-respected kind of czar of social services in one of our major Metro Atlanta counties. And I was there to facilitate a conversation with business leaders and philanthropists and government leaders, I was asked by a foundation to do it and get them kind of on a journey towards really good outcomes for the county. And and this czar, so to speak, this guru of social services, as people were talking about what they need to become self-sufficient, she said, essentially, they don't need those things that make them self-sufficient. They just need to be made comfortable. That sounds like they're putting somebody in hospice. That doesn't sound like a human being. You're treating somebody as a human being. And I think both sides sometimes view the poor as being people just to be cared for as opposed to equipped and empowered.
Yeah, I was listening to the criminal justice panel, and Sheriff Bailey made a point that I think he's right about, which is part of our sort of decision-making process in the criminal justice system is trying to figure out who are the people who want to change and who are going to embrace change. But also I think there's a part of that of recognizing that we should never give up on the idea that everyone has worth, everyone has the potential to be a contributor, and we should never stop pursuing that. And I think it makes a ton of sense to me what you just said, is that our society tends to put certain people in a box and say, these are the people that need to be taken care of because they can't take care of themselves. These are the people who will never be contributors, so we need to figure out a way to take care of them. And the sort of the robbing of dignity that occurs when we look at someone as someone who can't contribute. Right. And I think, conservatives make this mistake, but so do progressives, with the idea that we need these government programs in place and bigger and more because these folks aren't going to amount to much, is sort of the signal that's being sent. I'm curious, amongst the audience, how many of you have ever been in poverty in your life? Just by show of hands. All right. I've shared my personal story before, but I came up in a family where we most definitely ate government cheese. There was a period of life where we had a restroom that literally was a 5-gallon bucket, and we walked to a community pool to take showers at night when nobody else would see that that's what we were doing. And I look at my life and say, there were people in my life that still believed in the potential that was there. And that because of that, I've been able to accomplish a few things, and hopefully we'll accomplish more. That's true of everybody in the audience. Like the people who just raised their hands are wearing suits, right? I know many of you. I know what your businesses are like. Someone believed in you along the way or helped you along the way as a community that allows you to be in the position that you're in. And I think oftentimes we forget that there's a transient nature to this. There are people I'm sure that you deal with on the coast that were in poverty that now are shining examples of what you can do when you believe in people.
And also I kind of lost my train of thought, but I think when people talk about, it's easier to give a person a fish. We've heard the adage, teach a man to fish and he'll eat a lifetime, but if you give him a fish, he'll only eat for a day. I think it's become real easy for us to give him a fish. And that's what it used to be community action. We were going to give you a hand up and not a handout. And it's easy to give a handout. So people are real comfortable giving handouts. And it has a lot to do with some of the leadership, quite frankly, but also the policy. If you're, again, it goes back to accountability. If no one is checking, and at some point you don't put in metrics to hold people accountable, they talked about it in education, and then it's too, again, the communities across the state are so different, but it's so prescriptive from the state. You do this, you do the same thing, and it's just not working. And it goes back to the stat that you quoted. Poverty is the same in Mississippi. And one of the things I said to Russ last week, I can't tell you what will work, but I can tell you what won't, because I've tried it. And we've had some successes, but then we'll get a new administration, they'll throw out the baby with the bathwater. They don't look at the data, they don't look at the results, and I think we're too small of a state to be in that predicament, quite frankly. I think we know each other, we should. Compared to Georgia, we're really a small state. I don't think I could go to any community in the state that I wouldn't know someone, and I pride myself on that. And I just think we need to, I think we need more collaboration, and I think that's going to come from state leadership, quite frankly. I think if they really understand the money that's being poured into the state and the outcomes, we really all should be just appalled at the outcomes that we're getting.
Russ, on the policy side of things, and I know we've talked about this quite a bit, there are some obvious ways in which the safety net has become more of a snare net, where it traps people. And it's going to require leadership from government leaders to change it. So just tell you a quick story. There was an Atlanta businessman who told a story about inviting one of his employees into his office on a Friday afternoon. She's a single mom, gave her promotion and a pay raise. She left his office that afternoon, Friday afternoon, in tears of joy, what she had accomplished personally, what it meant for her family. She came back to the office on Monday in tears and turned it all down. Why did she turn it down? It's because she would have lost thousands more in government assistance than she was going to gain in pay. And it made no economic sense. But I want you to think about her emotional response for a minute, because it gives you a glimpse into somebody getting government assistance. On Friday, she was joyful because of what she had accomplished. Remember, she came back to the office in tears on Monday, even though she was going to have more money than had she taken the promotion and the pay raise. So that person is a hero and is really kind of typical of so many people who receive government assistance. This is a mom wanting to provide for her kids, wants to climb, and the system traps. And here's a problem with people on the right. People on the right, typically, when they talk about safety net reforms that will help people, they don't talk about what will help people. They talk about fraud. We talk about fraud. I've been guilty of this. Talk about welfare queens. But that's painting with a broad brush, and it's not accurate. The majority of people are not cheating the system. The majority of people are being cheated by the system. And it's not necessarily intentional. Many of these programs have been set up with good intentions, but the reality is that there are people like Shannon, this woman I just mentioned, who is in this terrible situation of having to turn down a promotion. Almost, it felt like she was walking away from a dream in order to continue to provide for her family. And
I would say that that's part of the education that we need to have the discussion. She talked to someone that convinced her that that was the case, but actually it probably was not, because on the work side of things, she could qualify for more tax credits.
There are things.
Yeah, that they never factor in.
Yeah.
They never factor in, so that's part of the problem. When you're in an impoverished community, and I talk about this a lot, you talked about, and it's the same thing, relationships or resources. They don't know. I see it in my family. Where did you hear that? Because it's not true. Because they rely on handed information that's just really not true. If I had sat down with her and did the math with child tax credit, earned income credit on the working side, then she would have come out ahead. And also, I would say that one of the big, other than, the food stamps, I'm not real familiar with the requirements there, but I know on the HUD side with Section 8, they can lose a lot there. But they have a self-sufficiency program that really can put her, she could be a homeowner with a steady job. And those are the conversations we're not having. We're trapping people because they're relying on misinformation. Russ talked about, I'm starting LifeWise. I want people to understand the value of a good credit score. Because if you got a good credit score, you can, there are two ways to increase the bottom line. You either increase your revenues or you decrease your expenses. Most people that I deal with, or most people in my family, they can't increase their revenues. Some can, most can't. But they can decrease their expenses because they can increase their credit score and they know the worth of their credit score. So when they go to borrow money, you can dictate pretty much the rate you're going to charge me because you want a good customer and I got a good credit score and that proves that I'm one. So it's a lot of misinformation, and I think that is a big problem in minority, in marginalized, impoverished communities. They're getting bad information.
I'll counter that a little bit. So to a large degree, the information isn't clear. And a lot of times what we found is that, while you're clear on opportunities, there are a lot of others who aren't clear on it. So we've got a benefits cliff model that takes into account what they are eligible for beyond that. So you can see that there are people who will come out of it okay, but you can also see these really steep cliffs where even the assistance doesn't help. And so there is a problem, but you're absolutely right. There's this dearth of information, lack of clarity, and people don't know where to go.
So these are incredibly complex problems. Obviously, we're getting the surface in a way that hopefully starts a longer conversation in Mississippi. I do think that people often will look at those circumstances like the one you mentioned with Shannon, and they'll say, well, that's horrible, right? She should have taken the promotion. She should have worked her way up. And that's a rational viewpoint on this side of the conversation. Right. But the fact is, people are making, at times, good economic short-term decisions based on the incentives that are provided. And they may not see the long-term side of things, which is if she had taken that promotion, maybe there's another promotion down the road. Maybe she develops a skill set that allows her to become more marketable somewhere else. But when you're trying to put food on the table, 10 years from now doesn't seem like the priority, right? Right now seems like the priority. Right. So I do think we have to recognize the negative or perverse incentives that are created by policy. Some of the other examples of that are things like occupational licensing, where you've got thousands of dollars of fees to be able to go work a profession that you can't afford. You may not be able to afford to do a year's worth of training.
Or if you have a criminal record, you may not be eligible for that very specific job.
Sure. Alabama had one that I remember from a couple years back where they were training people to cut hair in prison, but there was a universal felon exclusion outside of prison for becoming a barber. So the state was literally spending money training people to do a job that they could not do legally when they got out of prison. And there are examples like that just throughout the system. But let's shift in the last few minutes we've got together from the policy side of it to the community side of it. And I want both of your takes on this, because I think the end result, we can do things on the policy front, but communities actually have to get engaged. Yeah. So, Randy, if you'll talk a little bit about what you've seen from a community engagement perspective, where you walk away thinking, well, there's something here.
Yeah. So one of the things that I mentioned the work that we did at the request of the state in the inner city on relationships and things like that, but we've also started 2 employment initiatives in 2 major metro areas. One is Columbus, Georgia. The other is Gwinnett County, our second largest county in the state. And essentially what we're doing is we're coordinating the efforts of businesses, nonprofits, and the faith community to identify the chronically un- and underemployed and help them get into work. And one of the great things about this initiative, this is one of those things that I've seen that has been really encouraging, is that Gwinnett is for instance, is a very diverse county, one of the most diverse counties in the country. But this goes back to what I said earlier, you get these different business leaders and nonprofit leaders and everybody kind of working together, politics falls away. They're not talking about it. And this was in the middle of COVID we were doing this. I mean, we were doing this work while the country was divided at so many levels. But at the community level, going back to what I said, communities of common interest trying to solve problems. It was fantastic. And again, they weren't waiting for the federal government to take action. They weren't waiting for the state government to take action, saying, let's do something here. So we're doing that in a couple communities. Great thing that I've seen is people wanting to work together. On the downside, one of the things you'll see, and this goes back to something we were talking about a minute ago, people need hope. So many of the people who come in for jobs, and we have mentors for them, they are broken. Their spirit's broken. They are discouraged. They think they won't get an interview. One of the things we had to do was convince all our businesses to commit to interviewing anybody who goes through our program so that we could tell them they'll get an interview. That was our way of keeping them engaged because they don't believe people care about them. So that's been a discouraging thing on one end because you have people who are so discouraged they don't have hope, right? But on the other hand, you have a community responding to that awareness and saying, okay, didn't realize that existed. Now we've got mentors and we've got businesses saying, we're going to give you an interview. Can't guarantee a job, but we're going to give you an interview.
Diann, you've done nothing but community work, right? Mm-hmm. That's where you've been for decades now. You said that earlier you couldn't tell us necessarily what the solution was, but you could tell us all the things that hadn't worked. Tell me a little bit, because I think you're probably selling yourself short in a way. Tell me a little bit about the work that you're doing at LifeWise to counsel young people, to help them understand some of the misinformation that you mentioned and how to better understand what's available to them.
Well, one thing, what I've discovered with the work that I did at Community Action, and I knew this for a long time, when you're trying to move people out of poverty and they have so many issues. I think my goal now is to help the working poor, and I think the working poor. They have a steady job. They're working. So I'm working with people that I'm terming a living wage, and they're struggling. I'm actually partnered with, and I think it's safe to say, the Scarlet Pearl. They pay a good wage, and so I know that credit is an asset. And everybody has an opportunity to acquire that asset. So I conducted three-day sessions at the Scarlet Pearl, and there were 128 people went through the session. I just talked about credit and payday lenders, cash for titles, and what the interest rates would be. Anyway, I had 128, but 67% they want one-on-one counseling because they know they need to sit down and organize and use the resources that they have better. It's a strong demand out there. And they call me constantly about that, but I'm just one person. So I think that if we work with the working poor, and of course they're closest to the others in poverty. And it's been my experience in life and in community action in my own family. If you get one or two out, they will help you bring the others out. Because it's a paradigm shift that needs to happen, and it's not happening. And I can just use examples in my own family. I was talking, there's out-of-wedlock births, but my one nephew that my sister didn't get married, he recognizes that. He said, I look at my cousins, and I can see the difference. Because, and even if it's, going back to the fatherhood initiative, even if the parents aren't married, what I would like to see for them is to co-parent the children, because they have a responsibility there. And that's a paradigm shift.
Yeah.
And if we give them those tools, the children are here and you're responsible, you can work together. And I've seen some really good results from that. We've had a fatherhood initiative before, and or the 7 habits of highly effective relationships.
Yes.
Yeah, they're great programs, but they're never sustained, and they're research-based.
Yeah. No, it strikes me in all of the panels, there's sort of a recurrent theme, because throughout the state, you've got people doing good things. And they're doing good things in their communities, but maybe they feel isolated, or maybe they feel like they're operating in a vacuum. And one of the things that we want to do at Empower is not to create some central hub, because I think that gets into central planning. But if we can connect all of the people across the state that are working on these issues, if we can allow for genuine knowledge sharing to occur, whether we're talking about reentry reform or things that we're doing in the community to rethink how we address poverty, then I think we could be in a much, much stronger position. Randy, I'm going to close with you. You traveled all the way from Georgia by way of Nashville, by way of Georgia, back to Mississippi because there are no direct flights into Jackson. So you've been working in this space for a number of years in your home state. As we get started thinking about how do we supercharge efforts in Mississippi, what advice would you give us?
Wow. First, I would say I'm still learning. Truly, I'm amazed at how little I know, or how much I thought I knew. And then the next day, listen to Diann talking about some of her experiences. I go, oh, okay, there's something new. How do you supercharge it? I think it's largely by basically developing a very clear vision that is rooted in the dignity of the individual. As a Christian, I believe everybody is created in the image of God. No one is that different than I am. There are people who long for relationships. That's why the stories that captivate us are usually about relationship. That's why most of us, this is a weird thing that I'm about to say, but if you think about it, you'd probably agree. Most of us would choose a broken bone over a broken heart. Broken bones heal more easily than broken hearts and broken relationships. So people are, they want to work. They want to have a sense of purpose and belonging. I think the way to do this and to get it supercharged is to organize around that dignity of the individual and say this is all about the individual. And then next step out, it's then about the community. And because lives are formed in homes, neighborhoods, and communities. That's just reality. They're never formed anywhere else. Homes, neighborhoods, and communities. And when things go badly for someone, it's also where lives are transformed. It doesn't happen any other way. Government programs may create a little stability, but ultimately what transforms a life is local. So I think build unity around the dignity of the individual, and then build unity around really making sure communities have what they need to succeed locally.
I think that's a good charge to end with. I will tell you that amongst all the panels that we've done today, again, this is the one that we probably don't have hard solutions that we're ready to share and say this is what we should go out and do. But I think we wanted to introduce this as something that's important to Empower and important to our state because we largely have felt like it's been ignored. There's a lot of conversation around the edges, but there are not a lot of solutions. And I think it's because it is complex and hard. We've got a state with the highest poverty rate, the lowest income levels, the highest out-of-wedlock birth. And if we want to be successful as a state, if we want an education system that works, we've got to realize that these things are intertwined. Mm-hmm. If we want an economy that's thriving and vibrant, we've got to realize that these things are intertwined. You can't ignore a whole piece of culture and expect to be successful without addressing some of the problems with that piece of culture. And I think our charge to you guys, one, is to be partners with us on this, to help us think about the good work that's going on across the state and work with us on this. I think there is a tremendous opportunity for conservatives and even people who don't identify as conservatives to come together and say, we care about people. And because we care about people, we're going to work to try and solve problems that are so daunting that oftentimes we just ignore them and don't even talk about them. We've got to be able to talk about them. We've got to be able to talk about things like fatherlessness in an honest way. And then I think we've also got to be willing to recognize that these are things that government may not have the solution for and often doesn't have the solution for. And it requires us not to do the easy thing and say, well, someone else will fix this problem or give a temporary handout. But it requires us actually caring enough about people in our community to work with them directly, which I think is the true biblical model of taking care of widows and orphans. So appreciate Randy and Diann very much for what was a great conversation. Give them a hand.